Here's your host, Dennis Rimmer.
Yes, it's yet another edition of Talking Books and Writing and Stuff, and today we're talking about books and writing and music and politics and a whole bunch of other stuff with Charlie Angus. Recently left politics. He's involved in all sorts of other frays and fights right now. Quickly, we have a book here, Charlie Angus, Dangerous Memory, Coming of Age in the Decade of Greed. But before that, sir, can you tell us about growing up in Timmins, Ontario in your early years? What was that like?
Well, my family were Scottish immigrants from the Hawkhill tenements at Dundee. Went to work in the gold mines at Timmins. My mother's family were Cape Bretoners who left the coal mines and went to work in Timmins. So they were very, very working class. They had an incredible love of music, which I guess I grew into. Lots of celebrations. It was a very multicultural community. So my sense of openness and a sense of the home as a place where people were welcomed in was very, very much part of what I grew up with. And my parents, they didn't end up, my dad didn't end up going to school till he was like college and university till he was 40. They left school young. They went to work, but they were incredibly open to the world. They were tolerant, and we grew up listening to my grandparents who, they were all miners and that, but they talked ideas, and so it was a great place to grow up.
Now, as you said, music was involved. Did you ever run into Shania Twain in Timmins?
Well, Shania Twain got me a television career for a while when she came back and was just becoming a superstar, and I went up with TV Ontario to do a documentary, sort of as a one-off, but I ended up a bit of a career. But she played many of the bars that we played, and those were rough bars. She was a kid in those bars. I mean, I didn't meet her when she was playing, but Timmins was a frontier town, so Shania comes by her street cred, honestly. I can attest to having played many of the places where she was brought in as a young girl at 1 o'clock in the morning because they had the liquor laws. She couldn't sing in there in that night, but at 1, when they stopped serving liquor, her mom would bring her in and she'd get up with the band and rock the place. And
oh my gosh,
it was a frontier town.
Right. So that's Timmins famous not only for yourself and Shania Twain, but for Tim Horton and the Mahavliches and people such as that. Is that right?
Well, the Mahavliches, it was a hockey town. I was the only kid who couldn't play hockey and that ever grew up in Timmins. I asked my dad once why we were so bad at sports, and he said that when God was giving out eye-hand coordination, the Anguses were in another room getting a drink.
Well, you have enough to play the guitar. So briefly now, the book Dangerous Memory, Coming of Age in the Decade of Greed, apparently it started when you opened a box. How did that lead to writing this book?
Well, I've been, I think like many people, trying to understand just how dark the world's gotten and how dystopian it seems. And I'm online. All these people from my generation are focused and obsessed about the 1980s and how great it was, and and it's like a well you fall into and you can't get out of when you're dealing with those nostalgic memories. But then I began to remember they were really dark times, and I was thinking of this young Gen Z who are looking at a world they think that may have no future because of the climate disaster. And I remembered being young and terrified of the potential for a nuclear holocaust, which was very, very, very real, and not knowing what else to do, how people started to organize. People went into the streets, and so I had a banker's box up in my back room, which had, punk posters from the day when I was playing music and notes I'd written as a teenager, and I kept a diary of the time, and I wanted to go back and meet that 18-year-old person that I was to see if there were lessons I could learn to make sense of the times we're in today.
And I know what you mean about the threat of nuclear annihilation hovering over us, because I'm a tad older than you. I grew up in the 50s and 60s. I know the Cuban Missile Crisis quite well and things like that. So yeah, it was always in the back of our minds, maybe, that something could drop from the sky one of these days and we'd all be gone. So is that kind of the feeling young kids have today, you think, maybe?
There's definitely, when I talk to young people and they say, well, what's the point? There's no future. And they said, you don't know what it's like to not have a future. And I thought, but I do.
Yes.
And there were things we did. And this isn't to dismiss their rightful rage, but it's a way of trying to make sense of what we did in the 80s. So to me, the 80s is a defining decade for incredible acts of grassroots resistance, but also it set in motion many of the things that were like a slow moving tsunami that have hit us super hard today, from economic insecurity, the rise of the 1%, the rise of toxic online disinformation, the climate crisis. So I try and walk the reader through the various Rubicons we crossed in the 1980s that brought us to this moment, because I'm really convinced that if we, as my grandmother, who was very Scottish, long Scottish memory, said, if you don't know your history, you have no way of knowing how to get out of what you're in. And I thought that this would be a way of, through my story and through the story of the times, bring the reader to a place to understand why we're here and maybe what we can do about it.
And what can we do about it?
Well, if you look in the 1980s, there was multiple actions. Like the apartheid regime was so brutal, nobody had ever thought that that could be taken down, and that was taken down through all kinds of nonviolent action. Nobody ever thought that the Berlin Wall would fall and the Soviet Union collapsed in a period of over 6 months. We squandered that opportunity for a peaceful future with the neoliberal agenda that came next, and I write about that. But, I mean, what stopped the Cold War wasn't Ronald Reagan yelling at Gorbachev to tear down the wall. It was millions of people who came out in the streets, who stopped the cruise missile from being developed in Canada, who marched in Europe and across the United States. Like, ordinary people did stuff because they didn't know what else to do, and I feel that that's the time we're in. We seem overwhelmed. We're terrified, but we were then too. And in those days, people came together and began to take action. And part of the story is my own journey from being an 18-year-old kid and the liberating impacts of punk rock. It was like, you didn't have to be good looking. You didn't have to be a great musician. You had to have passion. And that DIY identity, I think, really was a liberating moment in Canada. It created so many great artists, but not just in music, but in culture, in theater, and then television. People just saying, well, I think I should just do it. And that is, I guess, my message to this young generation is like, don't be afraid. Try it. And making mistakes is okay. It's part of life.
And I think I agree with you about the Reagan thing. I just shudder or cringe whenever I hear that Reagan brought down communism. I think of Lech Walesa, and the shipyard strikes in Poland seem to be, to me, the first kind of cracks in the wall. And that was, like you say, local grassroots resistance.
Yeah, the solidarity movement had a huge impact. My wife was from Alberta at the time with the Peter Pocklington and the Brutal Gainers meatpacking strikes, and I remember people in Alberta wore the Solidarity Alberta t-shirts, which we looked to those workers and thought, they're standing up and doing something. I mean, the other thing that brought down the wall was Chernobyl, the horrific nuclear disaster that could not be contained, could not be hidden. And I write about how some of Putin's war in Ukraine is kind of revenge on the 1980s, because the Russians didn't come out of the Soviet Empire collapsed, and Chernobyl played a big part of that. And these are histories we need to understand, because we're in this time where some of this, it's like the ghost of the 1980s is stalking the land around us, and we need to be able to identify them and understand how we got here.
And dangerous memory, some of the things that come up when you look through the book is like the riot of Christie Pitts. What made you kind of want to write about that incident, for instance?
Well, the Christie Pitts story is not in the Dangerous Memory book, but it may be in one of my next books, which was about the 1930s. I've been working on this book on the 1930s, although it seems to keep getting upended by what's happening today, because today suddenly, when I wrote the book, it felt very much like we were the 1980s redux, and now it feels like we're the 1930s redux. But I've done a lot of research on the 30s. I was really interested in Northern Ontario and the effect, because these communities were, they were isolated towns, but they were also very global, and the impacts of fascism and communism and the war in Spain. And the story of the Battle of Christie Pitts, that was the first time the Canadians took on fascism. 10,000 people fought in the streets of Toronto in 1933 when the Nazi group, hooligans in Toronto came out to attack young Jewish and Italian kids in the Christie Pitts baseball field. And the young Jewish and Italian kids came back with baseball bats and fought it out in the streets. And before that would have been just a bit of local lore, but now with the rise of the extreme right and the Proud Boys and all this stuff, I think these are histories that matter today because we look at it now in a different light. So I've just been doing research on Christie Pitts. I'm always finding these stories and saying, okay, how does it matter today? And these stories matter.
Margaret Thatcher's another name that was brought up in Dangerous Memory about how that kind of wrecked the unions and coal mining industry in Britain. Because what was her philosophy, reasoning for doing all of this, do you think?
Well, Margaret Thatcher, became a hero to so many on the right with her statement, there's no such thing as society. It's really a profoundly awful thing to say. But Margaret Thatcher was given this sort of credit for this, turning London into a global capital of finance. She destroyed the labor unions. She privatized so much industry. But I analyzed what her real effect was, which was that basically she sold off all the public interest and the public savings of England, transferring huge amounts of wealth to the 1%, creating huge inequity, so much conflict. And at the end of her reign, Britain wasn't any further ahead. There were people who were going around in pinstripes and limousines and Jaguars, while the rest were left stagnant. And that is one of the things that defines the 80s. It's known as the decade of greed. It begins as this era that has so much activism, but there was so much mercenary looting of the public interest in the United States under Reagan, then in Canada under Mulroney. But Thatcher, there's no figure in the 1980s who looms as large and as dark as Margaret Thatcher. So I write about these people and what role they played, and some of them are being really lionized and celebrated today. But let's go back and look at the real history of what Ronald Reagan did to America. I mean, he destroyed the American middle class, which was the greatest economic advance in the history of the world. And that was wiped out from 1980 on, and the statistics, and I write about it in the book, proves how it was done that took down the working and American middle class and created the precariousness and the uncertainty, and I think the political extremism we have today.
Well, I was working in radio in the U.S. in the 80s and early 90s, and the fairness doctrine, for one thing, was eliminated, which pretty much wiped out every radio station newsroom from here to Timmins and back, because you didn't have to, no requirements to have any local information, local news. We did it because it was a good thing to do, but not necessarily because it was mandated. And once it was not mandated, then all those corporate raiders that you mentioned, like KKR, they came around and took over and bought things up. Just as an aside, the station I was working for in Blaine, Washington, before I moved here, was bought out by the KKR people. Everybody was fired. Wow. The wages were reduced and the health benefits taken away.
Well, you see, there's two really important things there. One is I talk about KKR and the rise of these corporate raiders who stripped companies, fired workers, and drove it through junk bonds, which created this predatory capitalism that destroyed so much of what was really good, I think, in America. But when you mention the fairness doctrine, that was one thing Ronald Reagan pushed, because it used to be, well, you could go on and make statements on radio and television, but you had to have balance. And once they got rid of that, not only did they get rid of local news, but it gave rise to the Alex Jones, the extreme right, the toxic news culture that exists in the United States. It doesn't quite exist like that in Canada, because we still have the CRTC, we still have some rules, but you can look at public conversation in the United States today where people can't even talk to each other because they don't even know what's true anymore. Right. And that goes back to Ronald Reagan driving this agenda to get rid of that fairness doctrine, and suddenly everything starts to shift. All the ground of even reality itself and public conversation starts to deteriorate. And so when people see this, the online influencers and the rage haters and the American media, and they're trying to think, why is it so crazy? Well, these were steps that were taken that changed the complete nature of public conversation and public interaction. And once you know that, then you say, oh, now I know why we ended up where we're at.
Dangerous Memory is the book by Charlie Angus, coming of age in the decade of greed, which jumps us ahead now to your current resistance efforts. So what got you going with that? Was that Trump trying to take over Canada, or was it always part of your agenda, or not your personality, I guess?
No, I woke up the morning after the Trump election, when a convicted felon, a man who tried to, basically launch a violent insurrection against the government of the United States, was elected president. I woke up the next morning and I knew that we had fallen into a dark new world. And I sort of lead up to it at the end of Dangerous Memory that we were on the verge of something here. But when the Trump election happened, I didn't even know what to say, but I knew we were going into something very, very dark. And my wife called me. She was back home in Northern Ontario. I was in Ottawa. She said, you haven't said anything. Get online. Say something. And I said, I don't know what to say. And she said, other people don't know what to say either. You start speaking. And because I realized that we are now seeing an attack on the rule of law. We're seeing people kidnapped off the streets. We're seeing concentration camps being opened up in the United States. If you'd said that 8 months ago, people would have thought you were nuts. Well, now we're seeing it. So where do we go from here? So I started the Charlie Angus Substack Resistance. I started writing about it, trying to make sense of it. I have, last month I had 1.6 million people read our publication. We've got readers all across Europe, all across Africa, Asia, every state in the Union. And I was just writing initially about Canada and the threat, but I realized that we are in this new era and we need language. So I don't know, maybe I'm starting a new book to try and take us into where we're at with a dangerous future, because I think it's really important when you can articulate things and explain things through a historic lens. It makes sense to people. And then when you give people tools, they can start to resist and choose other options.
And if you look back at, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by William Shirer, it seems like Trump's taken everything out of the Hitler playbook and put it into the Republican Party.
No, this is absolutely true. And, if you said that a year ago, people would have said, oh, you're hysterical. But Trump actually has used many of the Nazi, he uses Nazi language. Former General Mark Milley said that he was always talking about Hitler and Hitler's notion of the big lie in terms of fooling the public. And I think I was tuned into this because as Trump election was happening, I was doing this research on this project I'm working on the 1930s. And it was starting to feel like I was in this weird alternate mirror, because all the stuff I was reading about the 1930s and feeling like things are moving towards a very, very dark place, and it was happening in the United States. So I think I was very attuned to some of what the Republicans were moving towards, because we're looking at a rise of authoritarian gangster fascism. It's different than the Nazis, but you're looking at arbitrary arrest of people. You're looking at concentration camps. This is a threat to the rule of law. It's a threat. When you can shut down Stephen Colbert's show because you don't like it, we're moving into very, very difficult times. So Dangerous Memory sets us up. How we got here, where we go from here, I don't know. Maybe that's the new thing I'm working on right now.
That's right. So why do you think people fall for this kind of stuff? Like, why had Pam Bondi and the person Caroline Levitt come up with such obvious and blatant, ridiculous statements? How do people fall for that kind of stuff, do you think?
Well, I think there's a real sinister grifter nature around Trump and the Republicans. I think the most dangerous thing is to think that, they don't really mean it. because they do. Because they don't care what the consequences are. The one thing that gives me an enormous amount of hope, and this is sort of why I'm doing these resistance tours and traveling and meeting people, is to reassure them. Canadians have done something extraordinary. Canadians standing up like this, that wasn't in anybody's playbook. I don't think it was in any of the Canadian media playbook and in Trump's playbook. Ordinary Canadians stood up and said, wait a minute, you're not threatening us. Wait a minute. You're not going to act like that and threaten us and threaten the rule of law. And I'm seeing this sense of determination from ordinary Canadians. It's incredibly inspiring. I think our political pundits and our talking heads keep trying to poo-poo the idea. Well, we've seen this before. Trump's being Trump. No, we haven't seen this before. No. None of us are old enough to remember the 1930s, and that's what we're seeing. But whether I'm in Newfoundland or Edmonton or small town southern Ontario, I meet ordinary Canadians, really just everyday people who come out to the rallies and they get it. I don't have to explain to them what the threat is, and they're willing to defend our values. So there is something, we're on the cusp of something that could be very, very dark, or Canada could be showing a way. And I get messages from Europe, I get messages from every state in the Union almost on a daily basis saying, we're watching you in Canada. You guys inspire us. So, you don't hear that in the national media, but it's there. Like, people are watching us. So we got to keep strong.
And how about Pierre Poilievre? You, of course, worked not with him, but in the same building with him for a long time. Was he trying to be a north of the border Trump, or?
Well, Poilievre is continually. I mean, I've known Pierre Poilievre since his 20s. He's a political arsonist, and it's what's always bothered me about that brand. I know I've worked with many conservatives. I've sat with conservatives on committees where we worked even across party lines on things that were important. But it's about putting Canada first, and if it's always about scoring a hit or a gotcha moment, we're in way bigger. Our times are much more troublesome, and I've never seen Poilievre rise to the occasion. He's really good at attack, but I haven't seen that statesmanship, and that's what we need right now. I mean, there's things I've got real deep concerns about Mark Carney, but Canadians needed a wartime prime minister, and Mark Carney stood up. He won fair and square because I think the NDP missed the ball. I'm sorry to say. I tried to give advice, but they did. They weren't seeing this. Mark Carney did. Now we have to keep him focused and actually get him to follow through on the great promises he made. But that's what democracy is. It's a work in progress.
You were a member of Parliament for a number of years, but you're not anymore. Do you have sort of sad feelings that you're not in Parliament still, or was it time to kind of move on anyway?
Well, I always said that the people will send you to Ottawa, and at the end of the day, you always have to know where you're going home to. And I was always going to go home to Northern Ontario. I spent 21 years in Parliament. They made my riding massively bigger. My riding's bigger than the United Kingdom. They threw in an extra 20,000 kilometers, about a dozen communities I've never been in before, hundreds of more miles. And I just said, no, I can't keep doing that. I felt that there was more things I needed to do after 21 years. My band Grievous Angels is on the road.
Yep.
And certainly with the Trump stuff, I felt I need to put I don't want to sound like I'm giving myself some sense of importance, but I felt I needed to be there to fight for Canada and this time of fighting gangster fascism, as opposed to just driving the endless roads through my northern constituencies. 21 years.
21 years.
Heck, wow. Getting to leave the ring on your own terms is as good as you can ever get, and every politician has to decide when the time. Politician said to me, every politician is like an athlete. They know when it's time to leave, and they wait 5 years too long. And I thought, I'm not waiting 5 years too long. 21 years came. I thought, okay, now and I feel invigorated to do writing, to do music, to do the activism in a way that I don't have to worry that the leader's office is going to phone and say, what did you just say?
Do they? Oh, I guess they would do that, wouldn't they? Once in a while.
It's happened. Charlie's an opinionated guy. I've been in trouble before. I've had my wrist slapped. That's okay.
Got a few more questions, Mr. Angus,
Yep.
because this has been wonderful. But I want to. Your Catholic upbringing seems to be quite a powerful force in your life. Is that right?
Well, I grew up in a faith that stressed our social obligation and social obligation to the poor, and that's I grew up with that, and it's always been there. I've certainly had my troubles with the church, and they tried to excommunicate me when I was first elected. I've taken them on the residential schools, but I believe in this notion of there's a greater good that we have to serve, and so that was a tradition I came from. And I find in these dark times, people keep asking me about my faith, whereas most years they didn't. But yeah, so I'm not proselytizing. I don't know what I am. I like to consider myself a Leonard Cohen Catholic, and I know Leonard Cohen's Jewish, but he certainly wrote great songs about all the saints. So that's what I am. I'm a Leonard Cohen Catholic with a bit of with a pair of brass knuckles with my rosary.
You and Britt, your wife, have been together officially, I guess, since 1986. How do you?
82.
82.
82.
Yeah. And you got married in 86 or?
85, yeah.
85. Oh, so Wikipedia is wrong.
Yeah, no, I haven't checked. I better, I don't know. So,
well, anyway, see, that's the only fact checking I can do these days.
Yeah.
What kept you together all these years?
She's fierce. I'm fierce. I met her. She was 22. I was 19. She'd just come from Alberta. She was a tough Albertan, and she said, you're either in all the way or I'm done with you. And I thought, well, that makes sense to me. She doesn't like politics. She's never gone to any of my political events. She said, you want to be a politician, you go be a politician. I'm going to do what I do. She's a writer. She's raised an incredible family. And, we're both pretty determined people. So it's, and I lose all the arguments at the end of the day. So there you go.
That sounds familiar.
Yeah.
The band, the Grievous Angels, you're still active, I take it?
We just did a tour through Northern Ontario last week. The band has gone back in the studio. I think that was one of the reasons I decided I knew it was time. We went back in 2020, recorded an album called Summer Before the Storm, and it was really exciting to write and play. We got some younger new members along with the old crew, and then we went in and recorded an album called Last Call for Cinderella, which did very well. And in 2 weeks, it's just in summer 2025, we will be in the studio recording our new album called Revolution.
And you're in touch with the Midas Touch Network. How did that come about?
It's been really wild. Since the Resistance tours happened, I don't think I've been on CBC national television in 6 months. But I started getting calls from Midas Touch out of Los Angeles who were paying attention to what was happening in Canada. I did a couple of interviews, and lo and behold, I couldn't walk down the streets without people saying, hey, saw you on Midas Touch.
Right.
So they've been a great crew to work with. They really care. I think what we're recognizing with the collapse of the mainstream media and the inability, to confront some of these things is we need to start creating media that is able to give people information in this time of resistance to authoritarian gangsterism and grifter politics. So Midas Touch has played a huge role. People follow it in Canada, so I've been working pretty closely with them, and we just may be talking about a Midas Canada launch, but you'll see.
Okay. Let's see. Do you have a couple more questions here? Do you have any hidden talents that nobody knows about except yourself?
Nope. I can't play baseball. Can't play hockey. Can't play football. My wife's a great football player. She can throw a long bomb. Britt, man, she could knock a football down what she said. She's from Alberta. She learned with her dad. But I can dance. My dad was the king of the swing dancers in Timmins when we were kids. Everybody talked about my dad being a swing dancer. So I like to dance. My daughters are great dancers, but that's it. And I'm a terrible cook.
Okay, and one more before we wrap it up. What's your favorite sandwich?
My favorite sandwich. Well, anything made by my daughter Lola, who has a beautiful tea shop in Cobalt that people travel all over, and I'm one of her carpenters, and she makes pretty darn good sandwiches. So anything she makes, I like.
All right. Charlie Angus, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, and may the resistance continue.
Well, thank you.
Thank you for visiting with us today. This is Talking Books and Stuff with Dennis Rimmer. Contact him at dennis@talkingbooks.tk. Thank you, and may all the good news be yours. Oh, and don't forget to check out his book, The Great Canadian Notebook, available across Canada and at amazon.ca.